Hello and welcome to Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. On this edition of the show, I'm going to be speaking with a couple of people who are not only dedicated to their own writing, but also enjoy promoting the work of others. Our first guests today are Kim Hutchinson and Irene Moore-Davis. Kim and Irene are both well-known active members of our local literary community, and together with their friend Sarah Jarvis, another talented and active writer, have created a podcast to help writers from this region showcase their work. And here on Scribes and Songsters, we really like what they're doing. So, Kim and Irene, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How are you both?
Very
Excellent.
good. Thank you.
So I want to get into your podcast and talking about how you do it and what you do. But I thought I'd have you sort of tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you do, and because you are really busy, both of you. Irene?
Well, I'm an educator. I'm a historian. I love to write. I do a lot of historical writing, but also poetry. And I've been involved in the literary community in Windsor for quite a while. I think this was my 14th year being involved in Bookfest Windsor. And so that's a wonderful literary festival, as you know. And we love to welcome authors from all over to that festival and give people a chance to interact with them. So we've had a chance to meet a lot of really great writers over the years from all over North America. But I really love the literary community here. And I'm so excited to have a chance to really promote local people.
Because often, and it's a very similar situation with us, because, you know, if you're Margaret Atwood, you get promoted at the national level. But if you're just a really good local writer, it's very difficult, you know, unless you win a Gilla or something.
It can be tricky, but I have to say we have so many amazing literary, talented people here in this community who have been picked up by all kinds of presses, who are having all kinds of success internationally as well. So that's thrilling.
And Kim?
Well, I like to say that I started my career as a teenage TV producer, which was true. And I've always written for a living. You know, I am still a creative director at a marketing company in Michigan. I have also done some journalism, not nearly as much as you, and some other different kinds of writing. I studied at the U with Alistair MacLeod a long time ago when I first came to Canada, so I dabbled in fiction and that kind of thing. But like Irene, I've been on the Bookfest Windsor committee for a long time, and that's kind of how the podcast grew out, is we started seeing all of these people that, you know, kind of started to tell a story about Windsor that Windsor needed to hear. And we also wanted to connect it to Detroit because we are a region and we do have a lot in common, especially creatively. We're makers here. You know, that's what we do. So
what was the genesis? Did you sort of sit down over coffee one day and say, hey, let's do a podcast?
Oh, heavens no, I bugged them for years. Yeah, I did. I'm like, we gotta do a podcast. We gotta do a podcast. So no, and it took, it's been last December since we finally said, you know, why not? Let's do it. So, you know.
And so what's the next step after you say, let's do it?
Kim really did a lot of research and made sure that we knew what we were doing, knew that we had the appropriate equipment and the ability to proceed, and really educated us a lot about what would be involved. I have to confess, when she first brought up the idea, I had never actually listened to a podcast. This was years ago, mind you, but I certainly needed the most education. But I do love to talk, and I love to read, and I love to speak with people who write. So it was just a wonderful joy to be part of this.
So talk about the logistics of it. Do you have a room set up like a studio? I mean, what does it look like?
Well, we started in a small studio over in Ford City, but it closed pretty quickly. And we kind of lost 3 shows in the process. And it was, so the beginning, our genesis was sort of difficult.
You were renting from somebody?
Yes, there was, but the studio closed. So, but that at least got us started. And then we decided, well, let's just make it a traveling road show. So since I do know people in the industry that I work with that, you know, are much more familiar with equipment than I am, I've always been on the other side. I talked to them about, well, what do we do? And so we got a couple of really good little audio field recorders, and we just kind of go wherever the story is. So, I mean, it's actually kind of freeing in that way, you're not anchored to one place. And we also do some live events, not as many of those. I think we like the conversations better, just talking about writing and, the challenges of writing. And yeah.
It's really wonderful how technology has allowed us to do this kind of stuff, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It is. And it's just such a joy to be able to bring people a little piece of a live event and then to have that cozy, intimate conversation with the author thereafter, and really to give people a sense of what it is that they're hearing, who's done this writing, everything that's involved, but also just the excitement that happens at literary events here in Windsor. I mean, there are a lot of towns that are a lot bigger than this that do not have such incredible turnout at your average poetry reading or book launch.
Yes, and there's a place called Fog Lounge, and it's extraordinary how many young people turn up for their poetry slams.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm always astounded, if I'm not going to be there, if I'm walking past, and the place is jammed.
Yes.
So it's heartening, isn't it, to know that a lot of young people are sort of involved in that whole literary world.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it's not just that we have these great writers in our community, but we have just an incredibly supportive community as well. Mm-hmm. The consumers are not just in their houses reading, under a cover with a flashlight. They're out in the open, admitting, confessing publicly that they like to read and hear poetry, and it's great.
How do you decide who you're going to interview? How do you choose your authors?
We seek bribes primarily.
I'm all in on that.
We try to ensure a good mix. I mean, what this literary community, and by this community, I mean both sides of the border, obviously. This is the Detroit-Windsor borderlands or Badlands or whatever you'd like to call it. We try to ensure that there's diversity in terms of the genres being covered, in terms of, genders and ethnocultural backgrounds and age and just the types of interests that people have. So we have such an embarrassment of riches here in terms of, the number of people we could interview. And we know that we will see many more.
Mm-hmm. Now,
that's part of the excitement of this. We're like 25 shows in now, I mean, so it's really just getting underway. Part of the excitement is discovering even how many more there are, really, really interesting, talented writers who are, working away somewhere and that we don't know about in Detroit. It's kind of nice to be able to cheerlead us here in Detroit and Windsor.
And we're also very lucky because we have some good independent bookstores, which for a while it was getting kind of worrisome that they seem to be going away, but they're thriving.
It's beautiful to see that resurgence in independent bookstores and in people's belief in them and their desire to support them. Mm-hmm. They play such an important role. I mean, it's not that we are anti-Toronto or anything like that, but we don't want the decisions about what people get to read to be made by, the corporate types necessarily. It should really be dictated by the tastes of your locale.
Mm-hmm. And those bookstores are so supportive of local writers.
They are indeed. And they're just packed all the time with all of these amazing events and activities. It's beautiful. Yeah. But we also have a lot of really excellent local presses. And I mean, the publishers in this town, in this region, are just really a delight. So many of them. We always talk about Black Moss Press and Biblioasis, but there are many others, and that's a joy as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, the format of your podcast, is it sit-around conversation, formalized,
It's pretty informal, I would say. I mean, a lot of times we'll start out just talking about a question, about reading or writing or, things that kind of, people enjoy. And then we'll, maybe start to talk more about the book or the writer or their career and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, we try not to make it too much like going to school. We want it to be more fun and interesting because that's how we feel about writing and reading. So yeah, we try to keep it a little bit informal.
Yeah. The nature of our equipment also dictates that we're very, very close to the people we're interviewing. And I mean, that kind of lends itself to a very intimate conversation that's friendly. I mean, you cannot glare at somebody in a off-putting, menacing manner when they're that close to you.
Yeah.
So it tends to be very informal that way, and sort of like a family around the kitchen table.
Mm-hmm.
In a television setting, you have time constraints. How much freedom do you have in what you're doing?
It's whatever we want to do.
Yeah.
And that's kind of fun because like you, I've worked with time constraints and it's fine. That's great.
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes it's good to work with, you know, that kind of structure. But at this point, it's like, well, hey, this is where the story's going. You can just kind of follow it, you know? So that's really nice.
If somebody really goes on, which is never a bad thing. I mean, these are all excellent storytellers, but if they really go on at length, we can cut it into 2 episodes, for example.
Which we've done.
Right.
Yeah. And it's very easy to do that. And no one is making us keep it to 30 minutes. So that's great.
Yeah. Now, is there one podcast where, no, first of all, do all 3 of you take part in all the podcasts?
I wouldn't say all of them, but most of the time we try to take that Charlie's Angels approach. And we find that
I can
works
see
well.
the 3 of you.
Well, and Irene and Sarah are the 2 more articulate ones. So, you know, I rely on them a lot and I just push buttons and, you know, take things. But I do like to be part of the conversation. So, you know, I do jump in here and there. But
I am publicly declining that suggestion that she's less articulate.
Yes, I know. I'm ignoring that one. So, has there been one where when you hit the off button, you've thought, wow, that couldn't have been better?
There have been several like that for me. I mean, again, we have these incredible storytellers who come on. Many of them are very generous with their advice and their suggestions for people that are hoping to be writers or becoming writers themselves. And it's really wonderful when they're willing to share so much of their process and of the things that make their writing work. And we're just so grateful to have them. So I would say a great many of them have just given me that feeling that this is really great. And I'm so glad we did this.
What do you get out of it most of all? You know, what is the greatest enjoyment?
I love telling stories in all kinds of formats. So I just think it's really fun. And also because I guess you might think of it as a busman's holiday a bit, but because I'm also involved in this kind of thing at work where there are more constraints, it's really enjoyable to just be able to do it, and not have, 12 layers of, people to answer to and all that kind of stuff. So I like that.
A podcast can really reach so many more people. It really makes a difference, doesn't it?
It certainly can. And I mean, it's so accessible. You can listen to it any time of day or night, wherever you are, at your desk or wherever. And I think that the informal and intimate nature of those conversations really makes people feel as though the author is sitting at their dressing table or whatever, at their kitchen nook. And it's wonderful to be able to bring that kind of information and that content to people so directly.
So how can people find your podcast?
allrightinsidcity.com. We have a website. It's also pretty much posted wherever you get podcasts. So, I mean, we use a distributor that puts it everywhere. So it's on Stitcher, it's on Apple, it's on, Google Play, it's on all of those different services. So, yeah.
And just a reminder that it's All Right, WRITE, in Sin City. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us.
This has been lovely. So don't forget to check out their podcast, All Right in Sin City. So go to their site. When we come back, Irene Moore Davis will tell us about her extraordinary ancestors and how she is documenting their lives. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Well, in our first segment, we talked with Irene Moore Davis, the co-creator of Windsor podcast. But now we're going to talk with Irene Moore Davis as historian and author. Irene is the manager for continuing education at St. Clair College and has been president of the Essex County Black Historical Research Society since 2010. In 2015, she was awarded a University of Windsor History Department Community Heritage Medal for her research and passionate teaching of Black history in Windsor and Essex County. Irene's work on Canadian Black settlements was included in the book Fluid Frontier: Slavery, Resistance, and the Underground Railroad in the Detroit River Borderland. Once again, Irene, thank you for coming. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
This was a formidable read. And if, I could have probably spent 3 weeks reading it and underlining so many things. So I just marked a bunch of stuff that I thought was really quite extraordinary because it had so much to do with this region. Perhaps you could just give us a summary of what's in here, and then we'll talk about some specifics.
So A Fluid Frontier is a book that was published by Wayne State University Press. It was edited by Carolyn Smarts-Frost and Vita Tucker, who are amazing historians. And it features 14 different U.S. and Canadian authors and historians who are all writing about this region and how important it was in the Underground Railroad era. We talk about slavery in this region, we talk about forms of resistance, and we talk about the Underground Railroad itself. So my chapter focuses on Black settlements in Essex County, but all of the chapters are excellent in some measure.
One of the things I made a note of was the Black loyalist, General William Hull. And he had quite an influence. And what I also, I'm not from this area. I try to sort of learn a lot about it. But, Detroit, occupied Sandwich, the whole Sandwich area was so steeped in the Underground Railroad and all of the Black slave settlements.
Oh, absolutely. All over this county, there were Black settlements that had incredible roles in not only the Underground Railroad, but the anti-slavery movement and, in creating this country that we now have. But I would say that Sandwich is a particularly fascinating area. It deserves at least one book all of its own.
Yes. And then Isaac Brock and Chief Tecumseh, there was a great piece on how they tricked Hull and surrounding a whole segment on the famous Colored Corps.
Yes. A lot of people don't realize that in the War of 1812, so important in the creation of this nation, there was a significant Black presence as well. And we believe, many of us, that that presence of Black soldiers in the War of 1812 as part of the Colored Corps actually inspired individuals of African descent to travel here on what we now know as the Underground Railroad. Seeing these free people of African descent fighting for the British was really an amazing and astonishing thing. And many of the Kentucky volunteers who were up in this region at that time had enslaved people with them who could carry those stories back to the South. So it is pretty impressive.
And of course, when they went back, they inspired others to come. And the American slave owners weren't too happy about it.
Oh, my goodness. They were not. The Canadian slave owners weren't too happy either.
No. And we'll get to them in a minute.
Yeah. But the American slaveholders certainly created all kinds of mythologies just about this region to keep enslaved people from trying to make the journey here. Everybody had heard about the Detroit River. They knew it was the fluid frontier. They knew that it was a really key gateway to freedom in what we now know as Canada. So they would tell their enslaved people ridiculous stories like that it was 1,000 miles wide or that it was full of monsters, that they would never get to the other side. And still so many people did make that journey very bravely.
And at one point, there were 30,000 former slaves here.
Yeah, the official government of Canada estimate is that 30,000 freedom seekers made their way to Canada, to what we would now call Canada. Some people say that it was more than that. It's hard to gauge it based on census records and things of that nature. A lot of individuals did not want to be counted or reported, obviously.
This book, A Fluid Frontier, is really quite an extraordinary read, but so is Our Own Two Hands, your book that you're in the process of getting out to the world. And as you can tell, there were many interesting things that I found in here. It's my understanding from the book is that this region is one of the most diverse populations of people of color.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we all know that this is one of the most ethnoculturally diverse regions in Canada, but specifically in terms of African descended people, yes, we have very vibrant communities made up of people from all over the Caribbean and the continent of Africa, as well as Underground Railroad descendants. And it's been very interesting to grow up in such a community and to just experience all of the gifts that that combination of cultures can provide.
So let's talk about your great-great-grandmother.
So Charlotte Perry wasn't actually an ancestor of mine, but Charlotte was a good friend of my grandmother's, and she wrote a book in 1967 called The Long Road, and that was a history of what they then called the colored Canadian in Windsor from 1867 to 1967. So she did an amazing job, and she had access to what she could get her hands on in 1967. We know a lot more now. We have a lot more access to research and records. And so it was decided that it was a good time to build on that book by Charlotte, the amazing Charlotte Bronte Perry, and expand it and make sure that it's inclusive of all of the African and Caribbean cultures that also make up the Black population here.
So I want to ask you how you sort of have been doing that, how you've been going back and taking that journey with your ancestors. Tell me about Marianne Shadd.
Oh, wow. Marianne Shadd is a personal hero of mine, and she's also my great-great-great aunt. And she's an ancestor or family member of many people in this region, so it's not just me. But Marianne Shadd was a person of color who was never enslaved. She came to Windsor as a teacher specifically to work with the population of refugees from American slavery. It was something she wanted to do. She was a single woman in her 20s when she came. The first thing she did was to establish a school in the barracks that I referenced earlier. So that she could work with the children in the day and the adults at night after work. And she taught all kinds of people. And then she made a very interesting decision, which was that she wanted to establish a newspaper. And that newspaper was the Provincial Freeman. And when she did that here in Windsor, she was the first woman in Canada to establish a newspaper and the first Black woman in North America to do so. So she's a person of national historic significance, both in Canada and in the U.S. In the U.S., her home in Washington is a National Historic Site. Here, she's a federally recognized person and just such an amazing role model for many of us.
And Robert Dunn was a relative.
Yes, Robert Dunn was my great-great-grandfather. His daughter, Irene, is the person after whom I'm named. And he was a businessman along with his brother, James. James was the first trustee of the Windsor Board of Education of African descent and then became Windsor's first town councilor. But before he did that, he had kind of an interesting experience in terms of access to education. His daughter, Jane, he wanted to send her to the white school and not just to the segregated school. He was a well-to-do man, and he wanted to really test that boundary. He was not allowed to send her to that school, so he sued the Board of Education in 1883. He was not successful, but he then ran for school board and won, and pretty soon that regulation was overturned, so that was really great. His little brother, Robert, was my great-great-grandfather. He also became a trustee and a town councilor. He served 9 terms as a town councilor in Windsor, and he ran for mayor.
probably the first man of color to ever do that.
That is true. Yeah.
Now, your grandmother's first cousin, Ada Kelly Whitney, she also did something pretty significant.
Yeah, Ada Kelly Whitney was, she was also the grandchild of formerly enslaved people. She was a very brilliant young woman. She became a teacher, and she was hired by the Windsor Board of Education. And when she was the first person of African descent hired by the Board of Education, and the first woman of African descent hired by any Ontario Board of Education.
You know, when we talk about the history of this region, do you find that people of color and the extraordinary people we're talking about right now are not always in the narrative?
I find that they're often not in the narrative, and sometimes we don't know our own stories. But I have to say that it's really important in this day and age to make sure that the history that we share with children and with ourselves as adults is as inclusive as possible. And, you know, while my focus is making sure that the stories of African descended people are out there, I'd love to see so much work done on all of the other communities that make up this great region. Everybody has had a hand in making Windsor what it is, for sure.
What's been the most significant part of this research? What emotionally has made you cry, laugh?
It's kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum, but I would say the hardest chapter to write in this book, and the one that took the longest, was the first chapter, because it dealt with enslaved people right here in our town, in our community. I would say on the opposite end, I was just so inspired by knowing much more detail. I think that many of us know a little bit about a lot of things, but this book project definitely made it necessary for me to learn a lot about each of those things. And I would say just that the history of repeated attempts and different strategies at resisting circumstances and not just accepting the status quo, I really got to see through the generations how people of African descent in my community have done that. Not just my relatives, but lots of other people of African descent.
So when are people going to be able to get your book?
So this is interesting. What you're holding is the advanced reader copy. We were very fortunate to get a Trillium grant actually to assist with the provision of many advanced reader copies to community members so that they could offer comments. And we got about 91 people providing feedback on the book. So that was great. We're now in the revision phase because their comments are to be taken seriously. And sometimes there were just minor things they wanted to suggest. And sometimes it was a whole other area or a whole other person that I hadn't heard about yet. So some more research is necessary, and we're looking forward to publishing the finished version in 2020.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there's so much more we could talk about, but keep an eye out for Irene's book. It will really be worth a read. It's called Our Own Two Hands. Thank you to Irene and Kim Hutchinson for your contribution to our show today. Thank you, Brian and Gary, for your stellar production. And a special thank you to Tony Toldo and the Toldo Foundation for their support. And also to Neil and Tina Queering. Last and biggest thanks to you, of course, for watching. Until next time, I'm Veronique Mandel.